This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. When's the last time you used a crosswalk? Did you look both ways, or did you assume cars would stop? Is it easier to just jaywalk, cross the street where it's most convenient? Is jaywalking any safer than using a crosswalk? Today, we explore the long-time tension that exists between pedestrians and the automobile. Now, it's not a coincidence we started talking about this show after a week of pedestrian fatalities in several Connecticut cities and towns, most recently in Hamden. Coming up, we'll learn about efforts to make roads safer from the Netherlands to San Francisco. And we'll hear from the director of street films about how Vancouver came to be the only North American city without freeways. First, when did jaywalking become a crime? And depending on where you live, it's rarely enforced, but the term symbolizes, again, the tension between pedestrians and drivers. Do you avoid walking on roads without sidewalks because you fear getting hit? And when you drive, do pedestrians make you nervous? We want to hear from you this hour. 860-275-7266. You can email Where We Live at WNPR.org. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I'm joined now by Dr. Peter Norton. He's associate professor at the University of Virginia and author of the book Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City. He joins us today from the studios of WVTF in Charlottesville, Virginia. Peter, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Lucy.
Let's talk first about our relationship with the road. I understand it's changed considerably over the last century. What is the perception these days, and how has it changed?
Well, you walk up to a busy street these days and you assume that streets are for cars. If you're on foot, you better be careful. Probably should cross at the crosswalk, wait for a signal maybe if there's a signal at it. And if you're a driver, you're thinking probably this is where I belong, and you may not even expect a pedestrian to ever step into the street. And if one does, you might feel alarmed or annoyed by it. And this is a total transformation of the street from what it was just a century ago, when it was almost the opposite in a way. If you were driving a car, it was like you were operating a dangerous machine where other people were going to be, and therefore you were the one who was really taking responsibility for doing something dangerous. And a pedestrian walking into the street was actually using a street for exactly what it was meant for. It was meant for pedestrians, for vehicles, for streetcars, cyclists, pushcart vendors, newspaper salesmen, shoe shiners, all kinds of people were using streets. And they used their own informal common sense a lot more than they paid attention to formal rules. And that's a complete change.
When we look at how a lot of people, cars, carriages, streetcars, had to share the road, there were quite a bit of pedestrian fatalities back then at the turn of the century. Tell us about that.
Roads were a dangerous place, and they got more dangerous when automobiles started arriving because those machines went faster than most other street users. And some drivers had the attitude that all they had to do was honk the horn and everybody was supposed to get out of their way, and other people thought that was very obnoxious. And people grew up expecting vehicles never to go more than about 10 or 12 miles an hour, and as soon as a vehicle was going faster than that, their judgments weren't really attuned to that. And also parents were used to sending their children out, especially in cities without a lot of parks or playgrounds. The children would play on the sidewalk, they'd cross the streets, sometimes they played in the streets. This was perfectly normal, but when cars came along, this was also very dangerous, and people, in particular children, were often hit, injured, killed by cars. And what's maybe most striking when you look back at the accounts of these events is how much the blame went on the driver and the blame went on the vehicle. The blame was not directed at the parents or the pedestrian who was hit. And the newspapers, all kinds of newspapers, the liberal newspapers, the conservative newspapers, the mainstream newspapers, generally all blamed the car and the driver. So the city was not a friendly place for automobiles and drivers.
I see there's a term, J driver, that came before the jaywalker. What's the difference?
That's right. Well, if you were a pedestrian trying to cross the street and you were annoyed because drivers were coming along, going fast and tooting their horns, you were going to think of hostile terms to call these drivers, and there were a bunch of them. Joyrider, Road Hog, and J driver was a popular one. So the word J we've really lost. It used to mean, it was an offensive term for an uneducated rural person, like a farmer or a hick, you might say today, except it was really harsher than that. And so the idea was, if you were driving around in the city like you would drive on a deserted country road without paying attention to pedestrians, then you were somebody who didn't know how to drive in the city. You were a J driver. And so this was one of several terms to express, the pedestrians used to express their annoyance at aggressive drivers.
I'm speaking with Peter Norton. He's an associate professor at the University of Virginia, author of Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City. Today we're talking about pedestrian safety, how to make our roads safer, and we're looking at the history of that term jaywalking. So, Peter, when did it become commonplace to then give the side eye to a pedestrian that was crossing the road, and how did the automobile industry play into that?
Well, the annoyance was pretty mutual almost from the beginning. Drivers were feeling annoyed by pedestrians who were striding into the street wherever they wanted. But all of the official judgments were on the side of the pedestrian. The courts, the newspapers, letters to the editor of newspapers, juries, all tended to side, the traffic police even all tended to side with the pedestrians. And for very good reason, that is that the street was legally defined as a public space, kind of like a park is. Anybody can use it, and they just need to use it safely. And of course, pedestrians don't endanger other people the way drivers do. Now, this started to shift because drivers wanted to be able to drive safely in the street. They wanted to be able to keep going without having to stop every 5 seconds. They didn't want to be subjected to extremely low speed limits that were common in the era and that reflected the notion that streets are really for everybody and not just for drivers. And through their local organizations, these are the sort of progenitors of the American Automobile Association, these local auto clubs were places where they could start to organize to exert some influence and change the norms of the street in their favor. And so you can see, beginning around 1910, auto club members and auto clubs starting to shift the pressure back at pedestrians. It takes them a while, but one of the techniques they found most effective was to make fun of or ridicule pedestrians who walked however they chose. And one of their most effective terms of ridicule for this was jaywalker, which was them taking the word J driver and turning it around and sort of throwing it back at the pedestrian. And it took about a decade for this word to really start to catch on. But the reason it did catch on was because of automobile interest groups like auto clubs really trying hard to get this word into circulation.
And so now we see that jaywalking, you can be fined for it, especially in places like New York City. But have we shifted the conversation at all? Like when we hear about a pedestrian getting hit or killed, maybe in the 20s to 50s, the assumption was, well, were they jaywalking? Was it the blame on them? But now we hear so much about distracted driving. And so then are we seeing the shift again, blaming the driver for when something like this happens?
I think you see these shifts going back and forth constantly, although one side tends to get the advantage for a period of time, as you suggested. So until the early 1920s, the pedestrians definitely had the advantage. They had the advantage in the courts, and they had the advantage in the court of public opinion, too. And one of the things that helped shift this in favor of drivers was when the first laws start to get on the books that actually require pedestrians to concede the right-of-way to drivers except at crosswalks. This comes in kind of gradually because you sometimes see this appearing on the books but not being enforced. But the first place where you see a no jaywalking ordinance getting on the books and getting enforced and starting to really change behavior is in Kansas City in 1911. And it spreads fairly quickly from there. by 1914, cities are painting crosswalks on the pavements and starting to require pedestrians to stay in them. And they can sell this to pedestrians by saying, this is your safe place to cross. You have the right-of-way here. But there's a price to pay for this right-of-way, which is that you lose access to the street elsewhere. And as you suggested in some of the questions you asked in the opening of the show, there are times when it actually feels safer if you're a pedestrian to cross in the middle of the block. You don't have cars turning around corners coming at you from 3 or 4 different directions. You can just look for cars coming from 2 different directions. So, to a lot of pedestrians, it is a loss to lose the right to make those judgments for yourself.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been talking about jaywalking with Peter Norton, associate professor at the University of Virginia, author of Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City. It's part of a bigger conversation we're having today on ways we can make our neighborhoods, our cities, safer. Does that conversation start by considering the needs of pedestrians or the needs of drivers? Depending on where you live, modern planning often prioritizes the car over the pedestrian. But that has been changing in recent years. We'll learn more from Europe and the West Coast. Right after the break, you can join the conversation, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're looking at pedestrian safety and how it relates to planning safer roadways and incorporating mass transit options to get more people out of their cars. Now, that's a tough sell in many U.S. towns and cities. After all, cars are convenient when mass transit options are few and far between. Now, how do you make roads safer? Crosswalks often pop up, but do they really work? I'm joined again today by Peter Norton, associate professor at the University of Virginia, author of Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City. Now, Peter, you talked a little bit about crosswalks before the break, but you mentioned that maybe the first crosswalk was happening around the 1920s. How has that crosswalk changed from then to now and what they look like?
Well, I should point out that actually crosswalks are a lot older than that. It's just that crosswalks, as we would recognize them as painted zones on the street, really date back to about 1914 are the first ones that you see. But crosswalks are actually much older, even by that name. When streets were paved with stone block, painting lines on them wouldn't work so well, but they had actually used different stones to indicate where the crosswalk was, and those stones were higher than the rest of the pavement so that they would be drier, they would be cleaner, less slippery, and so there were crosswalks, and there was a notion that this is where you will expect pedestrians to be, even though the law didn't say the pedestrians had to be there. Now, the crosswalks, as we think of them as like the only place you're supposed to cross the street in a busy neighborhood, yeah, that really does start in the teens and 20s, about 100 years ago. And yeah, I think you see a two-sided effect there. One is, of course, the pedestrians feel a little safer in the crosswalk, but the other is drivers stop thinking about pedestrians anywhere else. And this lets the speed limits be higher, which might be nice if you're a driver, but kind of reinforces the notion that if you're a pedestrian, your options for crossing the street are limited, and finding a crosswalk at a reasonable distance from where you are can be hard, or waiting for the signal to change when you're a pedestrian who's already going slow may be pretty burdensome for you. So I think a lot of things do change thanks to the crosswalk as we understand it coming along.
Now, I understand there's lots of innovative crosswalk designs in 2016. Joining us now is Peter de Wild. He's sales manager at Lighted Zebra Crossing, and he's calling us from the Netherlands. Peter, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lucy. Thank you.
So tell us about your company, and how did you come up with this innovative crosswalk design? Tell us what you came up with.
Yes, we're a quite new company, and call it startup. And the idea is, in fact, by coincidence, some years ago, there was a contest for children. And one of the questions was, what do we need to do to improve your safety in traffic? And the winning slogan was develop a zebra crossing with light integrated. And the founder of our company was asked to make a kind of a dummy crosswalk for a television commercial, which was lighted. And he developed it, and he showed it in some cities in the Netherlands and in Belgium. And the response was huge, was very positive. And then he decided to develop the real product, a lighted zebra crossing.
When you say lighted zebra crossing, so it's an LED lit crosswalk? It looks kind of almost like the piano keys are lit up?
Yeah, something like that. The white stripes of the zebra crossing are filled with elements with light panel. So the zebra crossing is very good visible in advance for the cars, for the drivers, but also the people who are crossing the zebra are kind of lighted from below. So they are very good visible for the drivers.
I'm curious about, in the Netherlands, is there a lot of talk about pedestrian safety? Are you seeing a lot of fatalities? Here in Connecticut, in the Northeast, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen, several people that have been walking on the road and have been hit and killed. And I'm just curious what the conversation is over in the Netherlands before you came up with this product.
No, the situation is not similar as it is in your country. What we learned in the meantime is that in the Netherlands the situation is quite safe for pedestrians. Because we have a lot of facilities for pedestrians. But beside that, there's a market for, let's say, the lighted zebra crossings. But what we learned in the meantime is that in the United States, many Vision Zero projects are running because of the many fatal accidents on yearly base. So let's say the market for us is not only for the Netherlands or Belgium, but in fact the American market is quite interesting for us.
Oh, really? What cities in the U.S. are interested?
Well, I cannot name the real cities, but some of the biggest cities we have contact right now. And what we like to do is to make some pilot placements. So people can get used to it and have experience in the behavior of the pedestrians, but also the behavior of the automobilist.
Mm-hmm. Also joining us by phone is Andrea Aiello. She's Executive Director of the Castro Upper Market Community Benefit District. Also some unusual and unique crosswalk designs over on the West Coast. Andrea, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
So tell us about Castro's rainbow crosswalks.
So the rainbow crosswalks are stripes of, they call it, the material is called thermoplastic paint, but it really is not a paint. It's almost like strips of colored asphalt that are melted into the existing asphalt pavement. So they will last for 30 or 40 years. And they're rainbow stripes going the long way across all four crosswalks at 18th and Castro, which is kind of considered the heart of the Castro, but also a very dangerous intersection. The organization I work for decided to pay to put these decorative crosswalks in combination with the City of San Francisco's effort to widen the sidewalks on 2 blocks of Castro Street between Market and 19th. So this effort was finished in the fall of 2014, and it was, as far as pedestrian safety is concerned, I don't have any of the latest MTA data, but anecdotally, I know that before the rainbow crosswalks were put in and before the sidewalk widening project, there were regularly, at least once a year, some kind of accident between a vehicle and a pedestrian in those crosswalks. And since 2014, I don't think there's been one. The crosswalks were done in combination with a couple of other pedestrian safety improvements at that corner, including some bulb outs and a left-hand only turn lane for cars going southbound. But it was part of a package that I think did improve the pedestrian safety at that corner.
And what has been the response from the community?
Oh, the community loves the rainbow crosswalks. We actually had a contest, not a contest, but people voted to pick the design that they wanted. There were 4 different options. 2 were rainbow colors, and the other 2 were decorations that reflected different aspects of iconic images in the neighborhood. So we did a vote kind of in person in one of the little pedestrian plazas over a weekend, and we also did an online vote. And both the online and the in-person results were 42% wanted the rainbow crosswalks out of the 4. And so we went with them. The whole reason why my organization paid for this was because some kind of decorative crosswalk as part of the streetscape improvement project with the widening of the sidewalks was the second most highest rated that the community wanted as far as public realm improvements. The first one was trees. The city paid for the trees as part of their project, but the decorative crosswalk was out of the city budget, so my organization paid for that to happen as part of the project.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're talking about pedestrian safety, and we just heard from Andrea Aiello, Executive Director of the Castro Upper Market Community Benefit District. They've unveiled rainbow crosswalks. Also, Peter de Wild, Sales Manager at Lighted Zebra Crossing out of the Netherlands. They have LED-lit crosswalks. I want to turn back to Peter Norton, who's Associate Professor at the University of Virginia. So innovative crosswalks, getting people to notice that they're there. How effective are these crosswalks, whether they're the traditional ones we see around our towns and cities, Peter?
Well, there's an interesting sort of two-sided coin element to this thing where, and incidentally, I've seen both of the crosswalks of your other guests through pictures, and they're gorgeous. But there is a sort of built-in risk, which is that the minute you make the crosswalks much more vibrant and attractive and interesting, which is something that people have been trying now for many decades. Like, for example, England introduced the Belisha Beacon, which is a sort of lighted globe at each end on a post at the crossing back about 70 years ago. And these, of course, make the crosswalk safer for the pedestrian, but they also can give the driver the implicit message that they don't have to pay any attention for pedestrians anywhere else. So in effect, it's like shaking the driver into attention at one point and then sort of letting them lapse into an even lower level of alertness elsewhere because their sort of threshold for attention getting has been increased. And it's interestingly in the Netherlands that you see some of the most interesting work to look at this from the other angle, which is to say, what happens if we get rid of all of the crosswalks? What happens if we get rid of all of the signs and signals to drivers to watch out for pedestrians? This has been famously tried in the Netherlands in the form of shared space, where they make streets open to everybody as they used to be, including pedestrians and drivers alike. And what they find is that the drivers become much more alert everywhere, which is good news for pedestrians and another approach. And there's probably plenty of room for both kinds of approaches.
So to be more aware of pedestrians, maybe it's a time to encourage jaywalking.
Yeah, in other words, what if you make a street a place where everybody's always welcome, and it's very clear that that's the case because you don't have any special designated markings for anybody, including for drivers, you really make drivers feel much more responsible. And so some safety experts caution that any infrastructure that makes pedestrians and drivers safer has the unintended effect of making the drivers feel less responsible for safety of themselves and others. And so their approach is to increase the responsibility of drivers, is to take away every such fixture, every such marking, and so on. And I suspect there's room for both kinds of approaches, but we do have that choice.
We're getting a tweet from a listener. Brendan writes, walking on unsidewalked suburban road, a small act of political rebellion. Another tweet from Rebecca. In Poland, we were told never to jaywalk. Big fines if anyone did. People wait for the light. No cars to be heard or seen. So that's interesting perspective over in Europe. But I want to thank Peter Norton. Again, he's associate professor at the University of Virginia, author of Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City. He joined us today from the studios of WVTF in Charlottesville, Virginia. Thank you for your time, Peter.
My pleasure, Lucy. It was also a thrill to meet both of your guests today, Andrea and Peter, as well. So my pleasure. And Peter de Wild is sales manager at Lighted Zebra Crossing out of the Netherlands. Peter, we'll be looking for your LED lit crosswalk soon in the States, I hope.
Yeah, we hope so. You will see it, absolutely.
Thank you again for your time. And Andrea Aiello, Executive Director of the Castro Upper Market Community Benefit District. They've unveiled and are using rainbow crosswalks in certain parts of the neighborhood. Andrea, thank you for your time.
Oh, you're most welcome. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Now, coming up, is it possible for a city in the 21st century to not have freeways? Well, Vancouver did it. We'll find out more from the director of Street Films. That's coming up. But first, do you love the conversations you hear on Where We Live? You can support this show and WNPR. It's our end-of-the-year fundraiser. Here are two of my colleagues to tell you more. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up Thursday, the Caribbean, its islands, its history, its people, all have had a profound influence on communities around the globe, including here in Connecticut. On the next Where We Live, we talk to author Joshua Jelly Shapiro about his new book, Island People. Join us. That's Thursday. Now, today we're talking pedestrian safety. Now, one way to make roads safer is to get fewer drivers. Mass transit options are key. Can you imagine a Hartford without I-84 cutting through it? Joining us now by phone is Clarence Eckerson Jr. He's director of Street Films, and I understand he's sometimes referred to as the hardest working man in transportation showbiz. Clarence, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
When did you start the showbiz part of your job?
I'd say officially maybe 2005. Somebody came up to me the year after I'd been doing this and said that to me about transportation showbiz. But I've been doing documentary films or things kind of on my own since the mid-'90s, been making short films.
So Street Films, what's your mission?
Well, we're a nonprofit, and our goal is to enlighten and educate people about biking, walking, transportation, open space and livable streets in mostly cities. And we've done 800 films, and I've personally done about 600 of those over the last 10 plus years. And they're just videos that we have online that people are able to use for free to, show in their communities or show to their local politicians or communities, fellow neighbors, and to try to make their cities better.
So you travel all over the world. How do you find these stories, these cities that you want to profile?
It's really a mix of kind of, factors, but mostly I'm really kind of out there looking for what's the newest thing, what's the newest twist, what's the new policy that a city's doing or what somebody's doing that's innovative versus, old school. And, so that brings me luckily to a lot of really cool places.
Cool places like Vancouver. That's why we invited you on today. They're the only North American city without freeways. How did that happen?
Well, it's interesting. In the 60s, and I always knew that Vancouver was the only North American place that didn't have any highways. I didn't know exactly how or why, and I figured it was probably something to do with a lot of places in the 60s, tried to rail against the car and stop freeways in their cities. But they just never really built them in the inner belt inside their, the inner city. And there was just one point when they were trying to build some along the waterways there. And I didn't even know the story, but I just uncovered it while I was there for myself, while I was talking to a gentleman named Andrew McCurran, who we happened to be doing some filming of something called the Sea Bus, which is a ferry, high-capacity ferry that goes back and forth across the water up there in the bay, and found out that actually had replaced plans to build a giant multi-level freeway that would go across the bay. And people decided they wanted that instead of a network of freeways. So that's kind of the basis, the one main point when they decided they didn't want freeways, but I think they had some other plans as well that they were able to forego.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. I'm speaking with Clarence Eckerson Jr., Director of Street Films. Now, in your film, we hear from former Vancouver Chief Planner Brett Todderin. Here's what he had to say about this rejection of the freeways, as you mentioned, in the 60s and 70s, and the impact that it has had on Vancouver.
That rejection of the freeways led up to building a different model of people living downtown, multimodal city making, that really culminated with Expo 86, which had a theme of transportation of the future. And it led to, as a catalyst, a lot of the transformation of the waterfront that we're now fairly famous for.
So because it's freeway free, how did Vancouver move forward with, we mentioned the C-Bus. I'm curious, how many, people ride their bikes to work and travel, and what impact they've seen on traffic?
Well, anybody who's been to Vancouver, and I'd been there a few times in the past 15 years, knows it's a lovely city. In fact, it's, famous in Hollywood for and television for doubling for cities, especially New York City. And it's very pedestrian friendly, very nice, beautiful place to be. But they decided early on that, they should make their city as open to people as possible. And I don't think they had such a grand plan back then in the 60s, but that kind of jump-started the fact that they did not want their place overrun with cars. And one thing they've done probably in the last 8-9 years is get more serious about getting people on bikes. And they have a plan by the year 2040 to get 66% of all people on either bicycling, walking, or taking transit. They had a goal in 2020 to get that to 50%, but they've actually succeeded in getting to that number 4 years early. And one of the main reasons was they were able to very quickly get more people riding bikes by putting in protected bike lanes, putting in a concentrated bike network. They just recently added bike share, and you can see it on the streets. I mean, there are many people bicycling, and usually a good sign that there are a lot of people bicycling in your city is that you go beyond the hardcore male athletes riding in their, spandex gear to work. And there you see children, you see mothers, you see older people riding bikes. So their current mode share during the commute hours, Monday through Friday, is 10% of all people are riding bikes. And that's pretty incredible for a North American city. Mm.
It does sound pretty incredible. And, I'm wondering, I know Vancouver was the site of the 2010 Winter Olympics. We're talking about, a lot of people coming into the city. How did then the city plan to get them around?
Well, I think they knew, first of all, without having major highways and a lot of streets that carry an immense amount of cars, that they had to get inventive. And they just thought right off the bat, well, we can't move people by car. We can't move the athletes. We can't move people coming to our city. So they were shutting down parts of downtown to vehicles entirely, or doing transit routes to get people, to move people. And I think, it sounds largely like they succeeded, and they also helped spur, a lot of events like these kind of get cities thinking, because you spend many years planning for an event like the Olympics, and it starts to make you think, well, where else can we build residential towers and housing, and what are we doing with our transit? Are we making the right decisions? And we have some funding available here. So I think big events like these do make cities think big. And even here in New York City, we had a failed bid for the Olympics a few years ago, and where they were planning to put the athletes' village, you're now seeing lots of housing and lots of real estate going up and lots of planning in parks. So I think this kind of can happen in any city, even if you don't host an Olympics.
That's interesting. Now, I'm wondering, in Connecticut, when we think about drivers, it's also a source of revenue, right? So we've got the car tax, we have a gas tax, it's revenue that the state wants and needs. When you don't have as many people driving in a place like Vancouver, how do they pay for all of this? The C-buses, I know your train system, the train system there in Vancouver is very robust.
Well, I mean, it's just a decision of the government. I mean, they've decided to prioritize all these other modes. They have right now, they just opened up a transit line that's driverless, and it's the longest one in the world. So they're trying different things. They have small water taxis all around. You see them with these multi-rainbow colored insignias on the side. Again, they have the bike share. They have car share. They have buses that are really very well done, and a good network of transit lines. And they're always thinking of what's next. So I think that's important in the city, not to get stuck in their thinking, and to always be looking to, well, what else can we do? And I think you're seeing that all across the United States even now. Most good cities are really trying to plan for the future.
Can you give us an example? I know, New York City obviously has different options, but, what are some other cities that are planning for the future, not stuck, as you mentioned?
Well, right now, Washington, D.C. has an amazing bike share system, and they are doing great stuff with the amount of people bicycling. New York City, we have protected bike lanes on almost half the major avenues now. Just a few years ago, we had very few. So we are looking in New York we are adding plenty more lots of ferry service on the East River as a way to get people around. So there are so many things out there. We're always in so many different cities. In Seattle, they have been increasing through voter referendums in the last 2 years. They both passed, but nearly 60% of the vote, adding money for transit, adding money for buses. And in Seattle, they are planning a great network of light rail and subway-esque kind of a grid to cover the city. But in the meantime, right now, the bus is king there, and they have amazing plans. They have seen 25% increase on some of their bus lines because they've been giving priority to buses on streets and creating dedicated lanes and doing innovative things like bus queue jumps, where a bus can come up to the light and it has its own special lane where it can bypass, 2 lanes of traffic with 10, 20 cars backed up, and they get a priority to go ahead of those cars when the light goes. So cities are trying to, kind of keep up, and since cities are growing so much, they really need to find ways of getting more people around because, the number of roads we have is limited. So you need to start looking at the corridors and say, how can we move more people? That's the end game.
Mm-hmm. So cities are thinking about it, but when we look at political will and what's happening with Congress, our new president-elect talking about investment in infrastructure, very highway-focused, what's it going to take to be more forward-thinking?
Well, with the whole new administration coming in, we still don't know exactly what their plans are, but most people do think, like you said, that it's going to be highway-based along those nature. And I think, again, this comes up to cities rising up, cities and states saying, we don't want to spend our money that way, or we've got a better idea, or, flat out saying we are going to possibly increase the amount of money we have to raise to make our subways better, our buses, our waterways, our bicycling infrastructure. The good thing is, I think right now we have cities along the East Coast and the West Coast especially that are pretty well along in their plans of what they want to do. So I think, it may come up to creative accounting or, maybe, getting the people's ear in the federal government to say, you really sure you want to do this? And I think, we're going to be spending a lot of time the next 4 years saying that.
I've been speaking with Clarence Eckerson, Jr., director of Street Films. We profiled one of the films that you produced out of Vancouver. What do you hope people will take away from that film?
Well, I think, especially in the alternative transportation, livable streets world, people tend to think that we are lovers, which we are, of the bicycle, but they don't realize that it really is a complete picture. We really want to increase the number of people walking and biking and taking transit. And Vancouver is a great example of how they really set about doing it right. 50% is a great number. Many cities across the United States would be so happy with that. So we need to kind of push stories like that out into the public and say, should be our model. We don't want to get rid of the car, but we want to increase the number of people that can use our roadways efficiently. And with cities just exploding in population, that's the future. And if we cannot accommodate people, we are going to just have worse and worse roadways for even the people that drive.
And if we want to see your films, where do we go?
www.streetfilms.org. There are over 800. Again, they're free for people to use to show their communities and, again, enlighten people. We love to spread the message. We love to see people hosting their own film festivals or things in theaters. I've recently been to Albany, New York, where they hosted us, and we were up in Vancouver and Seattle. So please watch the films and spread our message.
Clarence Eckerson Jr., the hardest working man in transportation showbiz, thank you for your insight today.
Oh, you're welcome.
And if you appreciate programs on Where We Live, we want to hear from you with your support. Here are two of my colleagues to tell you how. And thanks for listening.